Wondering how to fall completely in love with the people and things that surround you at home? I've spent the last 15 years studying how and where families thrive and what relational and house characteristics ignite us with that homey feeling. On this podcast, we uncover how our brains process the people we live with and the houses we live in so we can confidently create our homes to be wonder-filled connection magnets. Ready to give up the decision fatigue, comparison hives, overwhelm ulcers, and confusion chaos? You are in the right place. I'm your host, Carly Thornock. Welcome to Becoming Home. What's up, homies? I'm so glad that you're here. I would like to introduce you to a very good friend of mine. Is that okay that I call you a good friend, Sean?
Sure, because of our bridge from Sarah, absolutely.
This is Sean Tebor, and he lives, first of all, in Maui, but he is joining us from Santa Fe, from the most beautiful place. He just looks like a picture of serenity. If you want to hop on YouTube, you can see him in his glory, surrounded by this cool vibe going on. Sean is legendary, and this mutual friend that introduced us, Sarah Yamtich, I feel like she is legendary as well. And so meeting all these beautiful, amazing, spiritually connected, integrated souls has been such a treat for me. And Sean, every time I talk to him, I was just telling him this, every time I talk to him, I want to have a dance party. Like something ignites in my heart and in my soul. And I would say in my gut, because I know that Sean shares this like love of the gut with me. I just want to have a dance party. To me, that's when my soul comes alive, is when I'm dancing. So I'm so excited to introduce you to Sean. He has been doing integrative work for a long time, 38 years. He's done martial arts, he's done yoga, and now he's arrived at this place of integrated movement. The words that he says are so beautiful: alchemy, integration, functional, energy, breath, locomotion, integrity. These are the things that he's about. And Sean, thank you for honoring the Becoming Home podcast by being here with us today.
Carly, thank you so much for the opening, the invitation, and for such an incredibly enthusiastic. I'm already lit up. So thank you for having me. And let's dance.
So today we're going to be talking about the idea of sweeping the floor of the temple, which means cultivating spaciousness within and without. And just this title alone, just the idea of cultivating spaciousness inside of your soul and then letting that reflect outward to your external environment and everything that you do, your relationships, the way you approach the world and nature and other people. There's so much to be said on this. But Sean, tell everybody where the sweeping the floor of the temple kind of came from and how that's a part of you and your story.
Yes. So, I love to speak in metaphor for many reasons. And one of them is that we tend to be dissociated from nature, even though we are that.
So good. You guys, there's so many mic drops. I was just telling Sean, there's not enough mics to drop. Carry on. Carry on.
So there's this through my life, as a, in a beloved relationship, and first as a kid, like in the trees, in the mud, when you could still do that, there's like fewer and fewer places where you can do that. Just out there in the treehouse, in the creek with the crawdads. I grew up in Georgia, like rural-ish Georgia. There was this like inarticulatable, if I could say such a thing, experience of like, what is this like energy? What is this like? What is life force? And just feeling it and not thinking about it. It wasn't contemplative. It wasn't even in the mind. It was just like there was an awareness though. And I could even say that somehow that had like a hook in my gut somewhere. This is all hindsight, articulation, translation of the experience, but there was a hook in my deeper, what I would call now, like many things, the gravity center, innermost deep pit of the belly, pelvis, hara, lower dantian, if you will. And years later, as I grow up and I'm like maturing, and then I have a family, and these practices had been formed in their own way, mostly martial arts and yoga, informed from different perspectives, the experience of more, it was going deeper into that child impulse of like, what is this phenomenal energy within me? Started giving me ways to, and then I started teaching. It started allowing me ways to express it, to sit with it. And then there was, of course, meditation, and there was all of these practices. But what I also found, Carly, is that it seems like just in my own life, there's so much data, there's so much energy, waves and waves upon waves upon waves, an influx of such rich energy and intensity and magic that I could easily become. And I've been a sensitive my whole life. I've been kind of intuitive, which I really believe is everyone's human right, is to be an intuitive, pre-cerebral. And so we'll get a little bit more into that. But sweeping the floor of the temple came about as an evolution of personal practice to arrive again and again in my vital center. And it has everything to do with inhabiting fully the pelvic bowl, the healing the gut, of realizing that this brain is really designed, as incredible as it is, the cranial brain up in the head, right, is really designed to sort of listen to the brain of the gut. And then I'm working with people like all the time for years and years. It's like, wow, seeing the same pattern show up. The hips are tight. Oh, wow. What's that thing called? A chair over there? That's kind of the culprit. And all of it, the chairs really, you gotta have your legs, underneath you and not down far away at the floor. But anyway, the patterns of pelvic, let's call it inhibition. Let's call it pelvic restriction, hips, pelvis, sacrum, low spine, the gut's out of whack. I mean, and I'm generalizing. I don't want to paint this terrible picture. It's just really where we're at, is this challenge of, are we aware of our root? Are we aware of our deep primordial elemental connection to ground, to source, to mystery? And we end up in a culture where this, for whatever reason, there's this kind of incredible cerebral juice that's actually starting to program down through the body, and it's not actually meant to work like that. When we talk about sweeping the floor of the temple, this is one kind of metaphoric way of inviting ourselves to return, to not achieve or attain, it's to return to a sense of having that connection, that umbilical connection to source. It's actually not here, or even here on the forehead or here on the chest for people listening, right? It's actually up through the root space of the legs, the pelvic floor, into the deep belly. Okay. So sweeping the floor of the temple has turned into a practice of moving the pelvis around. I mean, just that right there, right? Like, okay, everyone, welcome to the podcast. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about re-empowering your pelvis and doing everything in your life pelvis first. What? When I'm supposed to drive my car pelvis first? What? Can you imagine? It's actually moving through space and time with this deep reality of moving from our core, from our essence, from our center of truth. So when you feel that incredible impulse of, maybe it's emotion, maybe it's just intuition. You know something before the brain has a capacity to translate it. And that's the beginnings of like channeling, like of really bringing the truth and your truth into the world, which I feel and have seen. And so, so much of this beautiful work is that it's really what wants to happen is this sense of midline, right? This central channel. And we're kind of blocking it. We've tangled it up. It's kinked. It's like a hose. It's kinked. The energy's not flowing. So if we go to the pelvis, and the metaphor is great. I imagine myself just with the broom, this old, like little Asian amazing powerhouse, just like sweeping the floor of the temple.
Yes.
And that rocking, of the broom sweeping back and forth is actually and we can play with this in a little while, is that the pelvis tip, for example, forward and back. right? So you can imagine the pelvis like a Tibetan singing bowl with a round bottom. It's perfect. So
Mm-hmm.
we let the bowl tip forward, and we let the bowl, yeah, nice. And
I'm doing it with you.
Right? Yeah. And so I'll guide something in a minute, but what's interesting is we set up a rhythm. We set up it's a pushing and pulling against our inner and outer fabric. Okay. So as we sweep the floor, we like have these brush strokes. It's rhythmical, right? Mm-hmm. And we're clearing the floor of the temple. The floor of the temple metaphorically would be the pelvic floor, the pelvic diaphragm. And there are two layers. So if we could, for example, if we could choose to empty the pelvic floor in such a way, and describing that can be difficult, so that it relaxes, but as it relaxes, the pelvic floor floats. It's buoyant like a jellyfish. And it's also somehow strong. It's a point of levity, okay, naturally. And diaphragms are like that in the body. So that it's just a metaphor. Sweeping the floor of the temple, can we clear the pelvic floor? Can we open up and make transparent the pelvic diaphragm and relax our tail? Our poor tail is tucked between our legs. We sit on our tail. Mm. Anyway, there's this deep remembrance of conscious animal where the pelvis is empowered. She's organized, mm-hmm. supple. You know, we actually know that we have buttocks. We know how to turn them on, mm-hmm. which is a thing.
Yes.
It's like a culturally anesthetized zone.
Yep.
Buttocks and belly, unless we, that's a whole other tangent. But so we play around in the pelvis, which can be very sometimes edgy or challenging because it's the zone of sensuality. It's the zone of high sensitivity. What's interesting is you reset the foundation, right, of the house, and kind of jumping a little bit into your world, right? If you got a good solid foundation, and yet this human foundation in the pelvis and pelvic floor is actually nice and level, and it's clear, we've swept the floor, then the temple, the actual temple, everything that's above it, okay, is going to naturally reorganize, not as a structural sculpting, but as guided by that foundational gravitational awareness. Okay. So to know in the body what it feels like, where the pelvis is not tipping forward or tipping back, we're not spilling energy, then the spine can start to reorganize, and all of the upper branches of this tree of life begin to find their full flourished bearing of all the gifts.
This is so good and so true. I'm a ballroom dancer. That's where I come from. And there was a moment in my training where I felt like my pelvis and my core was awakened, and my movement completely changed. The things I was able to balance and do, the way I was able to twist and turn, the way I was able to work with my partner, the way we were able to create was completely different. And when we're connected to our movement in our bodies, we avoid injury, we sustain energy. And when we allow our houses to have solid foundations spiritually, even physically, like these tasks of sweeping the floor, these things that just seem so simple that it's easily overlooked in the hustle and bustle. When we're centered, then everything else can flow. I love what you said, like not like a sculpture, not like, and then we do this, and then we do this, and here's how we're beautiful. It's just because we're so centered, we can access the full extent of all of our ranges of movement and of emotion and all the things. What do you feel like that's a good analogy? And are we on point? What would you add?
On point? Are you kidding? That's a cellular on point right there. And I do want to go deeper into that because, the pelvis is right in the middle. It's right in the middle. If we're lucky enough to have legs, it doesn't really matter. It's not so much about biogeography. It's more about energy, but the root of the spine is present. And what I have found and what I love playing with and inviting is that the pelvis is also kind of a gateway. If we could imagine that the energy of potentiality, of pure, benevolent source potentiality is actually flowing up the inseams of the legs, for example. So like inner arch, inner ankle, up through the inner calf and shins, the inner knee, inner thighs, and it gets to the gateway of the pelvic floor. And if we're awake enough and transparent enough in the pelvic floor to allow that energy to come into the bowl of the pelvis, The pelvis is like a prismatic translator of that potential energy into being. Okay. So potentiality is starting to tickle. It's starting to tickle into form. Formless is becoming form. And so the pelvis is kind of also, in a way, is kind of our umbilical connection to source. We realize we might actually be an expression, a creative expression of source. We are that. So hum, so I am, that I am. And so what happens is, tuning into how you were beautifully articulating it, is then at that pivotal moment, at that epic moment, as we begin to feel the possibility of the moment, let's say we're just dancing, okay, and you're ballroom dancing, you're driven from that place more than any place else. That's what I mean by gravity center.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, as it translates in the moment, and we'll stay with the metaphor of dance, is it moves down through the pelvis, through the hips, to the knees, ankles, feet, and is reflected back to us if we're on our feet by how we touch the earth with our feet. Even if we're in shoes, even if we're in, pumps. And so, not speaking from personal experience, but anyway,
the collective we.
And then as that energy continues on up through the midline, translating more and more with more articulation and colors and textures and phrasing, it meets the filter of the heart. It meets the filter of the lungs, the voice. The cranium is up here going, wow, like just blown away in the best possible way, because the cranium is actually hopefully in a space, the upper mind is listening to the lower mind. So yes, the expression ripples from that epicenter in the deep core in every direction. And it does so, the more we are able to feel all of our fibers and cells communicating as one, the organism is organized, then we have access. This is where you were going. It's amazing. We have access to greater and greater articulation of the expression of creative energy. Okay. And we see it in dance. We see it in so many of the arts of movement. But I'm also talking about, like, can we be fully in the brilliant fire of that expression, but also remain supple and spacious? Okay, so are we sovereign? Do we have that deep temple belly still spacious and open and relaxed while we're sprinting, or while we're doing gymnastics, or whatever it is that we find ourselves doing? Can we integrate the action and the spaciousness, and do they become the same? Do they become one?
So for like moms who are in the trenches with little ones at home, where they feel like housework is overwhelming and they also want to create a beautiful environment around themselves, but there's this like subtle, always omnipresent feeling of never having enough time and maybe being drowned just like a tiny bit. How does this relate? How can we keep this suppleness, this openness, this rootedness, while we feel like ducks, where we're kind of going a million miles an hour also at the same time? Because these, from what I'm understanding you saying, and totally correct me, we need to be able to do both. It's not so just meditate forever and forget it all. And neither is it forget being centered and just get the things done because you have little humans depending on you. There's a marriage. And when it's grounded, it becomes something. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing up probably the most, what I would consider to be the most advanced practice, which is actual integration. And for me personally, it's never going to stop. It's a lifelong practice. I don't have any destination. I just know, because I tend to be aware enough in the moment, more or less, when I'm able to find this harmony. And we set up, we end up with this, you spoke to this, there's almost a polarization of spiritual practice or any kind of practice, and then the rest of our day, the rest of our life, what we spoke to earlier. Yeah. And what I find just so incredibly powerful and also like a rich challenge is, what is the alchemical moment where we're actually able to be fully engaged and be spacious at the same time? So to answer the question, it really has everything to do with conscious embodiment. So are we aware, not just cognitively, That's one aspect of mind. Like from yoga, you would call it the intellectual mind is manas. But we also have, and then there's ego. There's ahankara, which is our sense of I am as a function, right? Before it becomes I am.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's a whole other. Alchemizing the ego is like the other side of this practice.
So good.
Right down the middle. Right down the middle is if you take the word Buddha and you switch the A for an I, buddhi. That's discernment. It's the part of you that knows that you're freaking out while you're freaking out. And it doesn't have judgment. There's no self-judgment. That's ego. So there's a discerning piece, but I need to make this so clear. It's not just the mind discerning, because that's not the discernment I'm talking about. The midline is the full length of the body. It's like a deep keel in the water. Okay. And it goes beyond the feet, down and beyond the head. And it's, we can talk about the tree of life and the Taurus and all of that, but another time. But the midline is something you have to feel. And along that central axial channel, the hara, is this gravity point down in the pelvis that we've been talking about. So it is a literal practice to, when we sweep the floor of the temple, we need to know how to be able to choose. And choice is probably the greatest gift of conscious embodiment. We choose to, I'm just going to say it, we learn how to let go, but we have the discernment to know what it is we're letting go of.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I've been fascinated with that ever since my daughter was 3 years old. Because, she didn't sleep for the first 3 years of her life. Like 2 hours was like, that's it. She's like, all right, guys, let's see what you're made of. We're taking turns going up to her room where she was in bed with us, whatever. And Muna and I are just my partner and I are taking turns, and it's like 4 o'clock in the morning. I'll make this quick. And it's 3 years. And here I am teaching yoga and talking about, we're getting into the Yoga Sutras and talking spirit consciousness. And boy, oh boy, did I feel like a hypocrite, because every time I would go up there, I literally had a practice, Carly, looking down at my feet before I would enter her room, because I was already just like so fried. Okay. Looking down at my feet, and I'm breathing and I'm just letting go as I walk into her room. But I wasn't really letting go, because I would start to amp up. I couldn't. And so what happened is I had this moment where I was fully in my body, and I'm standing, and she's on a futon. And I see myself from the tree line outside the house. We live in this canyon and up on Santa Fe Trail here in Santa Fe. And I saw myself standing there being all flustered from another perspective that I didn't think about or it wasn't contemplative. It just happened. And in that moment, that discerning external view, whatever is necessary at the moment, helped me drop back into that. And I had such a profound release there was a choice made in this sort of like, the total, I guess in a way, I don't want to make it too intense, but like in a way I was aware of how my system gets kind of possessed by the egoic charge. It's just attachment. And at that moment I was like, what am I doing teaching? Who am I? Really like very self-critical. But in that moment, my entire cellular body chose to let go. And as I let go of all of that charge, I sat down on her futon. I started crying my brains out, and she just got really quiet. She's 3, and she just gets close, and it just talk about rippling out. That was the core event. And for the first time in my life, I didn't let go by way of restraint or mental compartmentalization, which actually just makes us sick. I actually knew what it felt like in the hot moment to self-release. So we talk about like right action, Buddhist terminology, right speech, right everything. But what about right release? And what is that? So that was the path into this reality of like, oh my gosh, what's going on in the pelvis? What's going on in the kidneys, in the adrenals? And started this practice of instantly, I was like, my entire focus was alchemizing the ego and how it works during this kind of event. And so just to get back to it, the feeling, what it feels like to choose to let go without checking out, right? And this taught me the biomechanics and the bioenergetics and the biospirituality of pelvic orientation, empowerment, freedom, and everything else.
Whoa, there's so much gold here. This idea of letting go without checking out seems, I know a few years ago I would have been like, aren't those the same thing? How do you let go without checking out? What does that feel like?
Yeah. So, if I were to put one word on it, it's grace. Okay? It's engaged spaciousness. And it's actually our innate harmonic. It's our innate capacity embodied. If you look at, when I teach, I often get inspired. I'll show dancers. I'll show there's this amazing thing that National Geographic did. You can probably find it on YouTube, of cheetahs running 65 miles an hour, but in slow motion. And we study that slow motion experience and looking at how relaxed that cat is running almost 70 miles an hour. That's in this mammalian form, the muscles in kind of a gel state, rippling. Everything is in a relaxed power of connection.
Relaxed power of connection. Oh, yes.
So, there's technical terms like intramuscular, intracellular, intra meaning within, but it's also inter, it's in and within and between. But also, Carly, it's more than that. It's when an instrument is well tuned, it sings, it has and we are those instruments. All of nature is the 10,000 examples, to use the words from the Tao. But so there's something about our movement practice, or our spirit practice, our practice of our Zen practice, or whatever you want to call it, that we really have to bring all of these many beautiful, totally incredible entry points into what is universal about being human. Well, I can look at you and you have two humerus bones, and you've got two radius bones, two ulna. We all share that map. And yes, there's variation in that map, but our movement has been taught over hundreds of thousands of years through an evolutionary process of exploration and curiosity. What is possible? Source asks itself, to put a human paradigm on it. And so when you start to realize that, how do we engage, but also somehow almost be hollow at the same time? And hollow, let me clarify, because a lot of people are hollow. I don't ever want to be hollow. Hollow means more potentialities are allowed to move through you. We're not resisting or controlling. We're engaging the impulse, not trying to shape it. Okay. It shapes us. So it literally is a practice that is going to do a couple of things. Functional movement in this regard is an integration of exploration. And of course, we very quickly look at our lives. Don't do in our lives. We move, a tiny, tiny bit, but the joints are still happily, they haven't gone weird yet. The joints are still capable of a much more complex dynamism of their expression of creative energy. So when you dance, mostly you're on your feet, but there are people that dance that are on the floor for half an hour. We look at things like animal movement in humans. We look at locomotion. We look at function. We look at movement, and we fall in love, if we're brave enough to hug and kiss the modalities that brought us to this pivotal moment of just conscious movement. And then we ask ourselves, what is that? So the Embodied Keys practice is really all about setting up these, and this is very important, is the relational context, okay? So for example, if we're tipping the pelvis forward and backwards, we're actually expressing a dialogue between the front of the body and the back of the body. That back and that front are in relationship with each other. But how much are we actually tuning into something like that? So what it is to undulate, like the continuum work of Emily Conrad, and there's so many beautiful practices. The two sides of the body are in relation with each other. What does that point to? Well, those relationships point to what's between them, the midline, right?
Mm.
So basically,
So essentially,
essentially, we want to, in a way, simplify and diversify. Okay. So, and there's so many levels of awareness. What's the breath doing? Like what is the function here? Am I pushing? Am I pulling in a functional way? We're talking about functional pull, functional push. We have navigations. I'm just bringing in a little bit of the embodied keys language because it's really challenged and having a really good time at the same time, writing down some structure that was like, okay, this is an open coded, it's an open source code event here. Is that how are we going to describe and give a template for entering into something we all innately know, right? Mm-hmm. Human dynamic movement. And as we get into it, it's basically like it all points to, as we express our environment like we did when we were babies, we push and we pull and we taste and we sense and we breathe and we're so gelatinous, and then we start to strengthen and organize, and so we get taller. And it's kind of brand new for us to return to functional movement. And at the same time, it's also known. So when we get energized, the two of us, when we're sharing, it's because that cellular knowing, it so yearns for like what you already innately have access to and wants to open that back up again. So the dynamic of strong and spacious is just purely learned or remembered through this work of re-understanding ourselves through creativity, but not choreography. Choreography is fun. It's really fun. It's understanding how we show up in our moment-to-moment flow. Okay. Yes. And that is informed by just how diverse can we be when we move. Yeah. Did I answer the question?
So well. I'm on the edge of my seat again. So being diverse in our movement and understanding that we move around a midline and that there are so many push and pulls and twists and turns and forwards and backs that we can be exercising. How does understanding this, sweeping the floor of the temple, exploring the breadth and simplicity, how does this translate into our outer world, particularly into our house?
Wow, I love this. And when we had our first chat, I was super excited because I love to really intimately nest the interior environment, well, the actual living space, just the same as I must maintain and allow for in the body itself. So it's just a pure positive projection, the living space of the emptiness again, and this is meant in the sweetest context, the emptiness of the pelvis, the emptiness of the core. Again, paralleling that, it really means potential. There's potential. So when you sit and you look at an empty room or a room that's going to be reconfigured, I love doing this. I'm like, I can actually feel where things probably are going to go. And it's not so much visual, although the visual does confirm the intuitive design that I'm feeling. It's a spatial relationship that goes beyond the pelvis and the deep belly. And there's light and lighting, and there's time of day. I just love it. So it's really quite simple for me. It's kind of like, all right, well, we'll try that. But there's not a lot of like messing around with it. It's like, well, that definitely goes there. And this, yes. And then the colors and everything else. And so I think what's interesting is, and I really want to deliberately oversimplify, is that what happened through COVID for me is working with so many people and myself going through whatever this last 2 or 3 years has been an amazing opportunity to practice, is that where, and I'm generalizing and I'm speaking to the collective, where intuition had kind of gotten a little bit or a lot sort of packed down and hidden as the mind started to really, already there was this top down kind of pressure. Like, I've got to figure this out. I've got to figure this room design out. because it's only so many square feet, but we have to fit that queen bed in there, or that king bed, whatever. Just to stay with the context, the brain is sending signals down to a place they're just really not meant to go. So intuition was a bit stolen or hidden. And I can't be in a space and not feel it intuitively. And what is intuition? So we did kind of point a little bit earlier to this, that impulse of knowing that's pre-mind.
That comes from the bottom up.
Yes, it comes.
This is how I design as well. It's like such a body experience to know the energy of a space.
Right. Right. And because that is an expression of the inhabitant, and to do that for other people is amazing. But also I'm sure, and I haven't dived into your work and your realms, but I can imagine that you work with somebody to really set up this synergistic, intuitive space where it's like involve them, and let them create their space, and you're just holding space and reflecting. But it's so fun because it becomes everything that we are is an expression of this, the depth, the DEPTH, the depth of our inner space. And it's so remarkable when someone is able to, for example, like breathe into their kidneys. Like, what does that mean? Find the deeper diaphragm, cool off the adrenals and recharge the kidneys. And what is it like to choose to spread out the vertebrae, on an inhale and an exhale? So these are all kind of aspects of the practices that are many, many faceted, many layered practices that constitute sweeping the floor of the temple. I just love the Zen sort of, the space of, I love to get lost in that manual, chopping wood, carrying water thing. It's sweeping the floor. And so if I may, can we do a little bit of a guided thing?
Please. Yes.
Okay, so just sit as comfortably as possible. If you can sit on the floor, great, or on a cushion, great. And let's just take a moment to, there's a lot of words and we love the language, we love the sharing. It's pointing to something else, it's pointing to something deeper, the finger pointing to the moon. So allowing ourselves to consciously exhale, which I would invite you to not shape the breath, try not to control the exhale, but rather allow for the exhalation to just be cellular. So imagine every cell of the body like sea foam on ocean waves. The exhalation is just the movement of the powerful wave that moves the sea foam, the cellular sea foam. And see if you can allow your sense of awareness to drop from the cranial mind down through a softening heart, down through the diaphragm, all the way down into the bowl of the pelvis. And what if you could actually breathe the pelvis? Or more specifically, if you could allow the feeling of the breath within the pelvis. So this is not just a metaphor, it's real. Everything is completely connected by the collagen body in the collagen myofascial body. So we're breathing the Tibetan bowl of the pelvis and it's starting to resonate. Now feel the contact of the sits bones and just simply push down a little more through the sitting bones so that the pelvis is going to actually lean just a little bit forward. And then we're going to relax that and let the bowl of the pelvis kind of tip back. So imagine the top of the bowl spilling or pouring water backwards as you kind of almost tuck. The sits bones point forward. And then from that, you can even drop your chin. And if you're watching the video, you see what I'm doing. And then if you could tip the pelvis forward slowly, and then see how far forward the pelvis can tip, you're going to end up in a bit of a back bend in your low back or maybe the whole spine. Okay. And so we're going to go back and forth like this, letting the pelvis roll posterior, which means that the top of the pelvis tips back, the sits bones forward. And then we hook the sitting bones into the ground and we pull the ground back, the fabric of the ground back with the sits bones as the pelvis sits up and leans forward. Okay. So on your own, you're going back and forth. rolling the pelvis back and rolling the pelvis forward, but then go half as fast and twice as strong. And notice if the movement is very small, that's great. That's where we start. But we want to end up expressing the maximal range of motion of leaning the pelvis back and leaning the pelvis forward. However, we're holding that dynamism in fantastic strength. So turn on the legs, turn on the belly, turn on the buttocks, and turn everything on. Okay. So we have the sweeping, and this is the broom, right? The sit bones are like the bristles of the broom. And we're expanding and opening this, what is often a condensed space around the pelvis. We're opening up the fabric of front and back, of even future and past concepts. They take more, they're farther away from the present moment. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is pause and then change the way that your legs are crossed, or do something different with the legs so we don't hold the same position all the time. There's another fun thing. So another way to sweep the floor is, so sit high on the sits bones, which just means we're sitting as tall as we can, but without a back bend or pushing the chest or trying to present anything. Just meet the earth with your sits bones like they're a couple of acupuncture needles for the earth. She loves it. And what we're going to do is we're going to let the bowl of the pelvis, imagine the pelvic bowl rolling around in like a wide orbit. Okay. So imagine, seen from above, you could draw like a wide ellipse. And we're going to let the pelvic, laughing because like I'm sitting here and I'm like, wow, I mean, it's so incredible to like start consciously grinding. It's because this pelvic liberation. But again, I want to reiterate, as you go around either clockwise or counterclockwise, notice if the belly is guiding the pelvis or the pelvis is moving of its own accord. The latter is what we want in time. Change directions, go the other way. Now, again, turning on the glutes, the buttocks, turning on the belly, turning on the whole body to surround this movement with tremendous tonality, which is a form of awareness and intelligence. And where you feel a bit exposed, a bit tender, or even stretched, try to turn on that space, engage it more locally. And now, as we continue to move, change directions again. As we continue to move, just realize that the movement is clearing the foundation. Like, we're giving so much dynamism to the hips and the pelvic floor. It's really amazing. And we want to realize that we're actually literally creating more space for ourselves where it matters most in this precious pearl space along the midline. Midline is becoming mid-space. Okay, so now pause, change the way the legs are shaped. You can do any geometry, change it up, or just switch the legs again. And sit for a moment where instead of sitting on the sitting bones, push down into the chair or whatever it is you're sitting on, push down into your foundation to meet the earth energy. And notice if the pelvis leans just a little forward. And then what we're going to do is we're going to let the low band of the belly, like way below the navel, we're going to let the low band of the belly just gaze backwards towards the sacrum. I'm not describing sucking it in, but there's a gravity in the core that draws that belly attention inward while the sacrum spreads out like a kite. Okay. The pelvis is still sinking into the ground, pressing actively into the floors. The hips are working. Okay, so as the pelvis sits up and the belly kind of hollows backwards very softly, the fabric of the belly pulling back, find the bottom of the rib basket. Okay, and so think of it like the bottom of a bell. You're going to let the bottom of the rib basket actually relax backwards. The low front ribs moving back, the kidneys moving back, and then let the chest open. And let the head kind of rest on top. So as all of us are moving human temples, We want to have this connection with, you might feel in the pelvic floor, in the root of the pelvis, like a sense of flush or circulation or aliveness or all of the above. Could also bring up trauma. All sorts of things we're stirring the pot. But if you feel like you're activated, if you feel like you're more spacious, if you feel like you're rooted and grounded and you have access to something you may not be able to put into words, which is great. And this is some little bit of the taste of what we mean by sweeping the floor of the temple. And it's something that when you become very familiar with getting back home to the core, we can choose it all day long. I call it lovingly obsessing. And it's this reality that the integration, Carly, is really that you're in conversation with someone, or you're in some kind of challenging situation, and you're actually running in the background. Your pelvis is neutralizing itself. Belly is close. We're not rigid. We're not protecting ourselves. We're just attuned to the moment. And that is really what I call a high frequency of return. Like, how many hundreds of times a day does this inner core harmonic show back up again? How often are we aware of our pelvis? Unless we're in the bathroom, So seriously. And then the whole gut conversation, and there's a whole thing, right? And I just want to kind of drop this a little bit because it's really fun. Is the 3 R's, like R to the third. It's like something I would take on the road.
I'm ready. I would show up at that tour.
R to the third is something that I had to create for myself because I was starting to notice the machinations of what was happening in the moment, where I could either react or I could release. And so the first R is just the recognition, the conscious, cognizant, discerned recognition that there's entanglement, and it shows up as a charge. It's a charge in the body that doesn't really feel like it's healthy, and we have to cultivate enough sensitivity in our lives to know that it's there, right? This is at the root of most all dis-ease. Okay, so there's this hook or many hooks that are intense, and we're feeling the charge. Like I did when I went up to my daughter's room in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was like just shaking, like exhausted and fried and angry. How is it coming through? The level of possession. So the first, there's a recognition, a recognition. Okay, we're like, oh wow. So the second R is release. So we recognize, we release, and the third R is return. The return is a conscious return. We're coming home again and again and again until we realize, wow, we have so much momentum and inertia in this direction of being present in a body, conscious embodiment, that we have a real, it's a little judgmental. we have a deep practice, an embodied practice of moving stillness, of consciousness, of eating life with full activation and releasing at the same time. So we see them as separate, right? And so that's the other thing too, that polarization of like, we're full on or we're full off. We're alive and then we're dead, or we work our butts off and then we have vacation. How do we have vacation within the work? And this has been at the heart of my practice for so long, and it's happening. It's happening, and it's so exquisite and so yummy.
It really is. It's a delicious feeling, a savoring. There's a quote that I love. He was speaking to welfare, I think, being aware of others and like genuinely concerned for the welfare of the world. And he said, cultivate a lifestyle that is on a day-to-day basis its own reward. And I think this is kind of what you're talking about, where you have the rest in the work. We have the relaxation in the speed. We have the clarity in the chaos. All of this sort of thing. It's so inspiring. Sean, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your spirit and your energy with us. You guys, if you love what you heard, you can go find Sean at embodykeys.com. And this is where he teaches you how to move your body in a way that is healthy on all of the levels of your being. And I highly, highly recommend you guys go check him out. Sean, again, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Carly, deepest gratitude for you and your work and your play and your incredible enthusiasm. It's been an honor.
Look, we're going to have Sean back, you guys. Look for Sean. And in the meantime, go sweep that temple and go make a big mess. We'll talk to you next week. Hey, if you're loving what you're hearing and you want to know more, I invite you to go over to carlythornock.com and you can pick up a free guide. These are the 3 biggest mistakes that people make when setting up their houses. And I don't want you to make the same mistakes. And of course, in true Carly fashion, you know it's going to be a lot less about the house and a lot more about your perspective about the house, but with some good housey tips thrown in. Go over to carlythornock.com and you can pick up that today.